So today's video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be going over my personal history of how I, at 20 years old, bought my first house/investment property with only $5,000 out of pocket, and how I collected over $15,000 in the first year of owning that property. So I'm going to kind of read off of something I wrote, so it might sound a little bit scripted, but I'll do my best to get the full story for you. And like I said, I'm going to take you back a little bit before I was ever even thinking about real estate investing, and before I even had any sight of this in my mind, and kind of take you back to where I was coming right out of high school. So I'll be honest with you, life smacked me in the face pretty early. I was 17 years old. I just got out of high school. I was kind of born in the summer, so it was that weird time that I graduated at 17, but turned 18 like right after. So it was time for me to go get a real job. And I'm not talking about the job where I was going to bag groceries for a few hours after school, a couple times a week, and a little bit on the weekend. I'm talking about a real adult life, real-time job. So that was my mission. I had to go find a job. And once I got that job, I was a shipping person and what later became shipping coordinator at a manufacturing job where I lived. And it hit me quick that this life was not built for me. I'm not meant to be someone who works 40 hours a week and goes and punches a clock and punches out. I hated it from the get-go. I felt so out of place. Everyone around the area, it just felt like they were real-life zombies. They would just come in, check it off. Lunchtime, clock out, enjoy a 30-minute lunch, clock back in. And it would just, every day was the same. I hated it. And you were basically living and getting judged off numbers on a screen, because that's all that mattered, was profit for them. So as being in shipping, it was either you ship X number of items by the end of the week. If you hit it, nice. If you don't, guess what? You just won overtime and you get to come in on Saturday. I didn't work many Saturdays, and it wasn't because they didn't ask me to work many Saturdays. I just said no. And that's kind of when I knew this life wasn't for me, because I didn't want to be under other people's hours and other people's goals. I wasn't going to sacrifice my time and my life for their goals, which sounds weird, but that's just the way I looked at it. If I'm putting in 60 hours a week, it's not going to be for someone else, because I'm only getting paid a measly amount compared to what they're making. So from day one, I knew this wasn't for me. And like I said, this was my first summer out of school. So this was right when I was turning 18, right after 17, moving into that full-time position. I also got my first book that out of high school, I was able to pick what I wanted to read. And that was the first time I ever really was interested in reading a book. And the first thing that really got my interest was money, and real estate specifically is what started to pique my interest. So that's where I started finding books on that topic. One of the biggest books that I highly suggest for anyone that's looking into real estate investing or just changing their mindset around money in general should look into Rich Dad Poor Dad. You're going to hear that everywhere because it's one of the most popular books ever written about personal finance, basically, and just changing your mindset. But it does a great job just showing how the differences between how the rich think and how the middle class / poor think, and basically just showing how you want your money to work for you and you don't want to work for your money. Like, yes, you have to work to acquire money, but then you put that money to work for you. And that really hit me hard and was like, ooh, I like that idea a lot, especially being 18, fresh out of the gates of high school. I'm like, let's do that. That sounds awesome. So then I just started consuming more and more about real estate, trying to learn everything I could and really get a grasp on it so I could start to implement it and make a change in my life. And this path of reading books led me to house hacking. And this was the first thing that really I could grasp the knowledge. I knew what it was. It was easy enough to understand how the numbers worked and how I could make money and make this work. And essentially what it is, if you haven't seen it on my channel, is you buy a small multifamily 2 to 4 units. This allows you to use the same type of loan you would actually use to get into any type of single family house as a first-time home buyer. You can use that to get into this type of property, a 2 to 4 unit property. You're going to live in one unit and rent the remaining units, which bring in new streams of income and help reduce, if not pay, the full mortgage of that house you just bought. So this was now my like main focus in life. How do I get a house I can house hack? So that was my next thing, was hunting for the house and really hunting on getting that so I can really make this dream a reality and see if it actually works. And a little side note here is one thing I do want to mention to some people, especially when you're like where I was 19, 20 years old, basically 18, 19, learning about all this. So whenever I told anyone that this was my goal and this was my plan of getting a house that I could use as a rental property, all you're going to hear is negative, 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 negative. Oh, you're really going to want to deal with leaky toilets at 3 a.m. Oh, you're really going to want to do this, that, and just keeps going on. Either it's going to be stories from people who have never owned rental properties and all they hear about are horror stories, or it's going to be the people who tell the horror stories and spread all those rumors. And the only reason they dealt with those horror stories, I'm not saying they didn't deal with them, but the reason they did deal with them is because they didn't properly take care of their properties or properly manage / place tenants into their properties. So you're setting yourself up for failure if you're not actually taking the precautions to avoid those downsides of rental properties. Of course, those can be downsides, but if you mitigate it by actually having systems on how you screen and process tenants and collect rent and all that, that's how business works. You get systems in place and then it runs smoother. So you're going to hear negativity, but just know if you do the research, you learn the right stuff, and you get everything in place, you'll be okay. You're going to hear people tell you, oh, don't do it, it'll be the worst thing ever. Let them say it. Let them have their joy and be like, okay, you can tell me when I'm wrong then. So one of my biggest hurdles when I was looking into all this house hacking stuff was, of course, it just is a hurdle for anyone going to buy a house, is you need to show that you can afford and actually pay for the mortgage of the house. So you have to have work history. Coming fresh out of high school, I had to wait a little bit to actually get work history. So around 20 years old is when I had that 2 years worth of W-2s that could really show, hey, I'm a reliable worker. I'm bringing in money each week that I can easily pay for a mortgage, especially with the help of a renter, which are the properties that I'm looking for. So I was now in the position where I'm really starting to hunt for the properties. And one of the biggest things I want to tell anyone who's like in a position where I am, you're new to real estate, one of the biggest things you're going to want is a team. And a team consists of a lot of people, but the main thing that you want to focus on is having a really, really great agent and a good lender. I always say to go for the agent first, because the agent is going to know the lender that will work best for you and your situation. So that's why it's a little bit harder if you're in your position going to find a lender and then they're going to kind of put you with a real estate agent. I would rather go find the real estate agent, because that you can completely pick on your own, and ask the realtor, hey, do you have any recommendations for my situation? And if they don't, then you go do your research, but they should if they're good. And one thing I did was, this was kind of where I went a little bit wrong. I used a really popular local real estate agent where I live, and she was fantastic. Don't get me wrong. She is great, but she didn't deal a ton in the type of situations I was in. So some things got a little bumpy throughout the transaction. Some of it was actually not her fault 100%, but it kind of was. Now looking back on it, being a real estate agent, she should have caught it. But it worked out for me in the end, so I'm okay with it. But there was mistakes that happened, and just ask, like, do a little interview. You're using this agent to make a big purchase in your life. You want it to be someone you trust and actually has knowledge on what you're going to do. So interview them a little bit. Be like, hey, have you dealt with this? Hey, do you have rental properties? Do you deal with investors on an everyday basis? And really, like, try to find, my biggest one is, do you own rentals? Because they can't really like make that up, because a lot of people be like, a lot of agents, oh yeah, I work with investors all the time. And then you get kind of a couple showings in and you're like, this is seeming like they might not know what they're talking about too much here. Because the mindset of a regular real estate agent compared to an investor real estate agent is a world apart. Like worlds apart. What my thought process compared to most real estate agents, completely different. I'm a big guy of thinking, what's your future looking like? How are you going to set this up? Where a lot of other real estate agents are like, well, how can we fit you into this house to make you afford it barely, so that now your house broke when you have a house? I don't agree with that at all. So I will not put you in that position. But that was a little side tangent. Back to the story. So when you're going through all this process, you're going to be learning along the way and hopefully learn all this stuff before you go find the agent. But one of the biggest things you're going to want to come up with is your buy box. And essentially what that is kind of your minimum standards for the property you're going to be looking for. So for me, I wanted to cash flow $500 per door when I did not live there. So really any house hacking situation is going to be tough depending on the market. It's going to be tough making cash flow when you live there. Of course, if you have 4 units or a 4-unit property, so you're collecting 3 units instead of a duplex where you're only collecting 1 unit, it's going to make it easier to make the numbers work. But I was running these numbers. What's it look like when I live there? How much do I have to pay, if anything? And then what's it look like when I leave? Does it actually cash flow? Does this make it a good investment? So you're going to want to know those. And some of the biggest calculations you're going to want to know are 3 of them that really kind of nail down a quick and dirty, like, hey, this is something you should kind of pursue a little bit more and really get into. And the first one's going to be price to rent ratio. The easiest way to look at this is a 1% rule. You'll hear it all the time. And it's basically just saying if you are looking at $250,000 duplex, that duplex should bring in combined at least $2,500 in rent minimum. That's the 1% rule. And then the next one you're going to want to know is cash on cash return. And this one is pretty self-explanatory. What's your return on the cash you invested? Sometimes this can be a little bit tough to run when you're living in the unit, because again, if you're going to be paying $200, $300 a month to cover the full expenses, you're not having a return. So if you wanted to run that, I would run it on the first year you're out of the property and see actually what your return was on that. And the last one's going to be net cash flow. And this one is pretty simple. It's after all expenses, what are you cash flowing? Not just after your mortgage, after all expenses. So if you have to pay for fuel, the water and sewer, maintenance, landscaping, all that stuff, then what's your net cash flow? That's what you want to know. So those are the 3 biggest ones I kind of look at and really can determine if you should actually pursue a property or not. So anyways, that was kind of my history of how I got into wanting to look at real estate. Now it is we're still in the past, but it's like 2019, 2020 is when I really started going out and scheduling showings, looking at properties, and really getting some experience in real life on what's it going to look like to manage these, what's the numbers going to look like, and all that stuff. And it's going to be a little bit shocking probably at first just to see some of the states of some of these properties, but it's kind of good to really understand what you're looking at. So when I was looking, again, 2019, 2020, there was so much more inventory than what's in my market right now for multifamilies. Like there was at least 40 properties. So I was getting to run numbers on so much stuff. I was really getting to know how to run numbers really fast, because anytime something would pop up, even if I was like, oh, that's overpriced, I would still run the numbers just to get that practice in. So I finally found one. It was actually one that I ran numbers for like 3 months prior. And I didn't like it because the square footage I thought was too small. So it made sense numbers wise, but I was like, I don't know. I just don't like how small it is. Had a weird kitchen layout in one of the units. It was actually funny. It was the one I ended up living in. But I was like, I don't really like it. Kept sitting there. I was like, you know what? Fine. I was kind of getting that impatient part where I'm like, let's just put in an offer. So we got the offer and we got it accepted, and everything went really smooth, which was awesome. Again, this was when there was more properties, so there was inventory. Buyers had some leverage, so I leveraged it and actually got some closing costs involved. This was where some miscalculations happened with the agent, but basically what happened, day of closing, everything went smooth. We're at the closing table. Well, actually before, during the walkthrough, I was walking through the apartments, making sure nothing dramatic changed. And the downstairs tenant actually wrote me a check for that month's rent before I even closed on the property. So I'm already like, oh my God, woohoo, it works. We already got rent in hand and now we're actually going to buy the property. So then I go to the closing. $5,020 is what I brought to closing. And because of that miscalculation that happened, again, it worked out for me. But essentially what happens, FHA only allows a certain number back in cash from the seller. So I was short like $1,100. And the day of closing, I'm like, what the heck? Like the seller agreed to give me that. I didn't know it was part of FHA because, again, I wasn't an agent at the time. So I didn't really know those specifics. And I was just kind of a unknowing guy, frustrated that I'm missing out on $1,100. So the seller actually cut me a check for that $1,100 at closing. So I have this $1,300 rent check, $1,100 in the other check, and I brought $5,020 to closing. I'm like, oh my God, this is awesome. So essentially that is what my story was leading up into my first property. So I brought $5,000. Again, I got $1,100 back. So technically I got in the property for like under $4,000. And within that first year, just collecting rent downstairs, I wasn't making cash flow, but I still collected in rents over $15,000, which is now my personal income because I own the rental property, which is just crazy to think about how this can be done. And this is why I push house hacking so much on this channel. And so whatever you find me, Instagram, wherever you're going to find me, you're going to see me talking about house hacking and investing because it has changed my life. I was literally able to quit a job and pursue this thing in real estate full time because of this. This was my first property. I still worked another 3 years, I think, as a regular employee, W-2. But I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background of where I was out of high school, 17 years old, to where I was at 20. That 3 years was just all learning. So understand, you're going to have to learn about this. I'm not saying you can't just like decide, oh, I want to go buy a property tomorrow and go do it. You can, but you'll probably screw something up. I'm just being honest. There's stuff you need to know about this industry and how to run it like a business because it is a business. That's the thing not enough people understand. So this is kind of my story and how I turned $5,000 into over $15,000 in a 12-month period. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, drop them down below in the comments. And yeah, I just want to kind of make this a little bit different than my sitting, just like educating type videos, which I love to do, but I wanted to show you what my story was and where my mindset was of, I knew right when I started working that first W-2 job, working 50, 60 hours a week, I was like, this ain't for me, bud. This is not for me. So I had to figure out from that, how do I get out of that? And within 5 years, I was done with W-2. So that is the power of real estate. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will catch you next week.